relief and bustle toward the door. "Thought she'd never get here. I'll just go and help her with our coat and gloves. She'll be wanting to pour the tea for her guests, I'm sure. Likely be looking forward to a cup herself." From what he could see of her face in the shadow of the bonnet, Tobias had a feeling that Lavinia was more in need of a healthy dose of some of the sherry she kept in her study, but the medicinal dose of spirits would have to wait. The guests waiting for her here in the parlour had to be dealt with first. Lavinia paused at the front door, searching through her large reticule for her key. He could read the signs of strain around her fine eyes quite clearly now. What the devil had happened? During the affair of the waxwork murders a few weeks ago, he thought that he had come to know Lavinia rather well. She was not easily flustered, overset, or frightened. Indeed, in the course of his own occasionally dangerous career as an investigator, he had met very few people of either sex who were as cool in threatening circumstances as Lavinia Lake. It would require something quite dramatic to put that grim expression in her eyes. The prickle of unease that drifted through him had a chilling effect on both his patience and his temper, neither of which was in especially good condition at the moment. He would look into this new situation just as soon as he could get Lavinia alone. Unfortunately, that would not be for some time. Her guests appeared prepared to converse at some length. Tobias did not care for either of them. The tall, elegantly lean, fashionably attired gentleman, Dr. Howard Hudson, had introduced himself as an old friend of the family. His wife, Celeste, was one of those extraordinarily attractive females who are only too well aware of their effect on the male of the species, and not the least hesitant to use their gifts to manipulate men. Her shining blonde hair was piled high on her head, and her eyes were the colour of a summer sky. She wore a gossamer-thin muslin gown patterned with tiny pink roses and trimmed with pink and green ribbons. There was a small fan attached to her reticule. Tobias considered that the dress was cut quite low for such a brisk day in early spring, but he was almost certain that the deep neckline was a carefully calculated decision on Celeste's part. In the 20 minutes he had spent with the pair, he had reached two unshakable conclusions. The first was that Dr. Howard Hudson was a charlatan. The second was that Celeste was an out-and-out adventuress. But he suspected he would do well to keep his opinions to himself. He doubted that Lavinia would welcome them. "I am so looking forward to seeing Lavinia again," Hudson said from the chair where he reclined with languid ease. "It has been several years since we last met. I am eager to introduce her to my dear Celeste." Hudson possessed the rich, resonant voice of a trained actor. It had a deep, vibrant quality that one associated with well-tuned instruments. The sound grated on Tobias's nerve endings, but he had to admit that it commanded attention in an almost uncanny fashion. Hudson cut a decidedly fashionable figure in an excellently tailored dark blue coat, striped waistcoat, and pleated trousers. His neckcloth was tied in an elaborate and unusual manner that Tobias thought his brother-in-law, Anthony, would have admired. At 21, Anthony was at the age when young men paid acute attention to such things. He would no doubt also approve of the unusual gold seals that decorated Hudson's watch. Tobias mentally calculated that the doctor was somewhere in the middle of his 40s. Hudson was endowed with the distinguished, well-modelled features of a man who would no doubt always turn ladies' heads, regardless of his age. His wealth of dark brown hair was silvered in a striking manner, and he wore his clothes with an authority and aplomb that would have done credit to Brummel himself in the heyday of his social reign. "Howard!" The strain evaporated from Lavinia's green eyes as she swept into the parlour. She held out both hands in unmistakable and enthusiastic welcome. "Forgive me for being late. I went shopping in Pall Mall and misjudged the time and the traffic." Tobias was fascinated by the change that had come over her in the past few minutes. If he had not caught that brief glimpse of her expression when she came up the steps, he would never have guessed now that she had been troubled. It annoyed him that the mere sight of Dr. Howard Hudson had had such an uplifting effect on her mood.
"Lavinia, my dear."
Howard rose and took both her hands in his long, well-groomed fingers, squeezing gently.
"Words cannot express how wonderful it is to see you again after all this time."
Another wave of disturbing, albeit inexplicable unease washed through Tobias. Hudson's most arresting features, aside from his riveting voice, were his eyes. An unusual combination of brown and gold in colour, they had a compelling effect. Both voice and gaze were no doubt extremely useful in his profession, Tobias thought. Dr. Howard Hudson was a practitioner of the so-called science of mesmerism. "I was so very pleased to receive your note yesterday," Lavinia said. "I had no notion that you were in London." Hudson smiled.
"I was the one who was delighted to discover that you were in town. Imagine my surprise, my dear. The last I heard, you and your niece had gone off to Italy as companions to a lady named Mrs. Underwood."
"Our plans changed quite unexpectedly," Lavinia said smoothly. "Emmeline and I were obliged by circumstances to return to England sooner than we had anticipated." Tobias raised his brows at that understatement, but he wisely kept silent.
"Well, that is certainly fortunate as far as I am concerned."
Howard gave her hands another little familiar squeeze and released her.
"Allow me to introduce my wife, Celeste."
"How do you do, Mrs. Lake?" Celeste murmured in dulcet tones. "Howard has told me so much about you." Tobias was briefly amused by her manner. The almost theatrically gracious inclination of Celeste's head did not conceal the cold assessment in her pretty eyes. He could see her measuring, weighing, and passing judgment. It was obvious that she immediately dismissed Lavinia as no threat and of no consequence. He was amused for the first time that afternoon. Dismissing Lavinia was always a mistake. "This is indeed a pleasure." Lavinia sat down on the sofa, arranged the skirts of her plum-coloured gown, and picked up the teapot. "I had no notion that Howard had married, but I am delighted to hear it. He has been alone much too long."
"I had no choice in the matter," Howard assured her. "One look at my beautiful Celeste a year ago, and my fate was sealed. In addition to making me a lovely wife and companion, she has proven herself quite adept at handling my business accounts and appointment book. Indeed, I do not know how I would get by without her now."
"You flatter me, sir." Celeste lowered her lashes and smiled at Lavinia. "Howard has attempted to teach me some of his skills with mesmerism, but I fear that I have no great talent for the science." She accepted the cup and saucer. "I understand my husband was a dear friend of your parents?" He was indeed. A wistful expression crossed Lavinia's face. "He was a frequent visitor in our home in the old days. My parents were not only exceedingly fond of him, they counted themselves among his greatest admirers. My father told me on several occasions that he considered Howard to be the most accomplished practitioner of mesmerism he had ever met."
"I take that as a very great compliment," Howard said modestly. "Your parents were both extremely skilled in the art themselves. I found it fascinating to watch them work. Each had a unique style, but each achieved amazing results."
"My husband tells me that your parents were lost at sea nearly a decade ago," Celeste murmured, "and that you lost your husband that same year. It must have been an extremely trying time for you." "Yes." Lavinia poured tea into 2 more cups. "But my niece, Emmeline, came to live with me some 6 years ago, and we do very nicely together.